"This is exactly where you belong," my daughter-in-law whispered at my son's wedding, and in that moment, surrounded by smiling guests and soft music, I realized that some people mistake kindness for weakness. I did not argue. I did not make a scene. I simply smiled. What none of them knew was that before the night was over, I would remember something that would change the way I saw my family forever. I'm Margaret Whitmore, 72 years old, a widow, a mother, and until that evening, a woman who still believed that love and sacrifice were eventually recognized. The wedding reception was being held in a beautiful country club just outside Columbus, Ohio. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light across white linen tablecloths and elegant floral centerpieces. My son Ethan looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, standing beside Vanessa, the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. I had spent months convincing myself that this day was about celebrating their future, not dwelling on my concerns about her. I had paid for much of the wedding without hesitation. The venue, the flowers, the live band, even the custom cake that stood proudly in the center of the ballroom. Every check I wrote felt like another gift to my son. Watching him happy mattered more to me than any amount of money. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in front of my bedroom mirror wearing a navy blue dress. It was the same color my late husband, Richard, always said brought out my eyes. As I fastened a small pearl necklace around my neck, I found myself smiling at his photograph. "Your boy is getting married today," I had whispered. "I wish you were here." For a while, everything seemed perfect. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. The band played old standards that reminded me of family gatherings from years ago. Yet there were small things that felt wrong. My seat had been moved 3 times. During the rehearsal dinner, Vanessa introduced nearly everyone in the room except me. The slideshow displayed dozens of photographs from Ethan's life, but somehow none of the pictures included me. I told myself not to be sensitive. Weddings were stressful. People forgot things. Still, a quiet ache settled in my chest. Then came the buffet line. I had stepped away from my table to get a cup of coffee when Vanessa approached me with a bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret," she said sweetly, "come here for a second." I followed her toward one of the serving stations. Guests moved around us carrying plates and chatting happily. No one seemed to notice anything unusual. Vanessa leaned closer. Her smile remained fixed. She gestured toward the large serving bowl of mashed potatoes sitting beneath warming lights. Then she lowered her voice, so only I could hear. "This is exactly where you belong." The words landed harder than she probably intended. Not because they were loud, not because anyone else heard them, but because they confirmed something I had been trying not to see for years. In her eyes, I was not Ethan's mother. I was not family. I was simply an inconvenience she wished would disappear. For a second, I looked across the room toward my son. Ethan was laughing with several friends. He never saw the exchange. Or perhaps he chose not to. I will never know. I simply nodded, picked up my coffee, and walked away. Vanessa probably expected tears. Maybe she expected anger. Instead, I returned to my table and quietly took my seat. The music continued. The guests celebrated. The newlyweds smiled for photographs. But something inside me had changed. Because as I sat there watching the reception unfold, an old memory surfaced. A conversation Richard and I had shared years before his death. A conversation about family, trust, and a responsibility that he insisted only I could carry. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, I understood why he had been so determined that I never forget it. The memory followed me through the rest of the reception like a quiet voice I could not ignore. I sat at my table while guests danced beneath the chandeliers, but my thoughts drifted years into the past. Richard had always been a careful man. He believed that families stayed strong only when someone was willing to protect what mattered most. About 6 months before he passed away, he asked me to meet him in his study on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I still remember the sound of the rain tapping against the windows and the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen. He held a folder in his hands and looked unusually serious. "Margaret," he said, "there may come a day when people see this family differently than we do. If that day ever comes, Promise me you will remember what I am about to tell you." At the time, I laughed and told him he was worrying too much. Our son loved us. Our family was close. Life felt stable. Richard smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "Just promise me." I promised. Later that afternoon, he explained something that I had not thought about in years. It involved a trust established by his grandfather decades earlier. The trust was never discussed openly at family gatherings. Most people assumed Ethan would eventually inherit everything automatically. The truth was more complicated. Richard explained that the trust existed to preserve the family legacy, not simply transfer money from one generation to another. There were safeguards, conditions, responsibilities. Most importantly, there was a trustee with the authority to protect those assets if necessary. At the time, I barely paid attention to the legal details. I trusted Richard completely. I assumed the information would never matter. After all, what kind of family plans for conflict before conflict even exists? Looking back, I realized Richard understood people better than I did. He saw possibilities that I refused to see. Across the ballroom, Ethan and Vanessa posed for photographs with friends. The photographer directed them toward a large floral display while guests applauded. From a distance, they looked like the perfect couple. Young, successful, happy. Yet the image felt strangely incomplete. For several years, I had noticed small changes after Vanessa entered our lives. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just little things that slowly accumulated. Holiday invitations arriving at the last minute. Family traditions quietly replaced with new ones. Decisions being made without including me. I always found excuses for it. People get busy. Newly married couples need space. Times change. But sitting there that night, I began reviewing those memories one by one. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Vanessa rarely challenged me directly. Instead, she worked in the spaces between conversations. She redirected plans, controlled information, influenced decisions. Most people never noticed. Perhaps that was what made it effective. My attention shifted toward the head table. Vanessa was laughing with a group of bridesmaids. Her smile appeared effortless, confident, victorious. For the first time, I wondered if she believed she had already secured everything she wanted. The thought stayed with me. A few minutes later, someone approached my table. It was an older gentleman wearing a charcoal suit and silver-rimmed glasses. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Caldwell, Richard's attorney for nearly 20 years. I had not seen him since the funeral. "Margaret," he said warmly. "It has been far too long." We exchanged a brief hug. Then his expression became thoughtful. "I was hoping we might speak sometime soon. There are a few matters related to Richard's estate that deserve your attention." My heartbeat slowed. Not from fear. From recognition. Something important was beginning to move. Thomas glanced toward the dance floor before lowering his voice. I believe Richard expected this conversation would happen eventually. As he walked away, I looked down at the untouched slice of wedding cake sitting in front of me. For the first time all evening, I was not thinking about humiliation. I was thinking about the promise I made to my husband, and I had a feeling that promise was about to become very important. The reception finally ended close to 11 o'clock that night. Guests drifted toward the parking lot carrying small wedding favors and leftover flowers while the newlyweds prepared to leave for their honeymoon suite downtown. I stood near the entrance for a few moments, watching people say their goodbyes. Vanessa moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting compliments and posing for photographs. Every smile seemed effortless. Every laugh perfectly timed. Looking at her, no one would have guessed how carefully she controlled the image she presented to the world. As I collected my purse, I noticed something that brought back another memory. A group of relatives were thanking Vanessa for organizing such a beautiful event. She accepted every compliment without mentioning the countless people who had helped make the evening possible. The florist, the coordinator, the caterers, even Ethan. It reminded me of something Richard once said. "Pay attention to people who always need credit," he told me years ago. Eventually, they reveal what matters most to them. The drive home felt longer than usual. My house sat on 3 quiet acres outside the city, surrounded by mature oak trees Richard had planted decades earlier. The porch light welcomed me exactly as it always had. Steady.
Familiar.
Reliable. The silence inside felt comforting after the noise of the reception. I slipped off my shoes, hung my dress carefully in the closet, and made myself a cup of chamomile tea. Then I sat alone at the kitchen table and allowed myself to think honestly. For years I had dismissed small incidents because I wanted peace. The first Thanksgiving after Ethan married Vanessa, she changed dinner plans without telling me until the night before. The following Christmas, family photographs somehow excluded me from several group pictures. On Ethan's birthday, a reservation was made for everyone except me, only to be corrected after I asked questions. Each event seemed minor on its own. Together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Around midnight, I opened an old photo album Richard and I kept in the living room cabinet. The pages held decades of memories. Ethan fishing with his father at age 10. Family road trips. Backyard barbecues. School graduations. In every picture, Richard stood beside us with the quiet confidence of a man who believed family was something you protected. As I turned another page, an envelope slipped onto the table. I immediately recognized Richard's handwriting. The envelope was sealed and dated nearly a year before his death. My heart quickened. I carefully opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The message was brief. Richard wrote that if I was reading those words, circumstances had likely changed more than either of us hoped. He reminded me that trust was not measured by promises. It was measured by actions repeated over time. Then came a sentence I could not stop reading. When someone shows you who they are consistently, believe them, even when it hurts. I sat back in my chair staring at the paper. Suddenly dozens of memories felt different. Not because they had changed, but because I was finally looking at them clearly. The next morning, shortly after 9 o'clock, my telephone rang. It was Thomas Caldwell. His voice sounded calm and professional as always. "Margaret, would you be available for lunch tomorrow?" he asked. "There are documents I would like to review with you personally." I agreed, without hesitation. After we ended the call, I walked to the kitchen window, overlooking the backyard. The autumn sunlight stretched across the grass, casting long shadows beneath the trees. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, something important was shifting. For years, I had been reacting to events as they happened. Now, for the first time, I intended to understand why they were happening. And deep down, I suspected that lunch with Thomas would answer questions I had not even known to ask. The next afternoon, I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early. Thomas Caldwell had chosen a quiet place overlooking the Scioto River, the kind of establishment where conversations remained private and nobody rushed you out of your table. I found him seated near the window, with a leather portfolio resting beside his chair. When he stood to greet me, his expression carried the same seriousness I remembered from years earlier. After we ordered lunch, he wasted very little time. "Margaret," he said, folding his hands carefully. Before Richard passed away, he asked me to prepare for several possibilities. He hoped none of them would become necessary. My stomach tightened slightly. Thomas opened the portfolio and removed several documents. The papers looked ordinary enough, yet something about the way he handled them made me pay close attention. The Whitmore Family Trust was designed differently from most trusts, he explained. Richard believed wealth should support future generations, but he also believed it should be protected from poor judgment and outside influence. Outside influence. The phrase lingered in my mind. Thomas continued. Most family members assumed Ethan would automatically gain complete control one day. That was never the arrangement. I stared at him. Then what was the arrangement? Thomas slid one document across the table. The final authority belongs to the trustee. I glanced at the signature page and immediately recognized my own name. For several seconds, I simply looked at it. Then I looked back at him. "Me?" He nodded. "You have been the primary trustee since Richard amended the trust nearly 8 years ago." I felt almost embarrassed by my confusion. I vaguely remembered signing paperwork during that period, but Richard handled every legal detail. I trusted him completely. "Why would he do that?" I asked quietly. Thomas smiled sadly. Because he trusted your judgment more than anyone else's. Lunch arrived, but neither of us touched it. I found myself rereading sections of the documents while memories surfaced one after another. Richard was never impulsive. Every major decision carried purpose. If he placed that responsibility in my hands, he must have had a reason. Thomas carefully reviewed several provisions. The trust protected family properties, investment accounts, and certain business interests accumulated over generations. Significant changes required trustee approval. Sales of major assets required trustee approval. Large distributions required trustee approval. By the time he finished explaining, one realization became impossible to ignore. The future Vanessa imagined might not be the future she expected. Has anyone else reviewed these documents recently? I asked. Thomas hesitated for a moment. Actually, yes. My eyes narrowed. Who? Approximately 6 months ago, Ethan requested information regarding several family assets. Shortly afterward, there were additional inquiries. From Vanessa? Thomas gave a small nod. The answer did not surprise me as much as it should have. Instead, it connected another piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, I understood why certain conversations had become more frequent. Why questions about properties, investments, and future plans kept appearing during family dinners. Why Vanessa always seemed interested in discussions involving money, while pretending otherwise. Thomas reached into the portfolio once more. There is something else you should see. He handed me a copy of several email requests. Nothing dramatic. Nothing openly inappropriate. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. Repeated attempts to gather information. Repeated questions about authority. Repeated efforts to understand how decisions were made. As I read through them, I felt neither anger nor satisfaction. Only clarity. For years I had wondered whether I was imagining things. Whether the distance growing inside my family existed only in my mind. Sitting across from Thomas, I finally stopped questioning myself. The signs had always been there. I simply chose not to see them. When lunch ended, I stepped outside into the crisp autumn air carrying copies of the documents. The river moved slowly beneath the afternoon sunlight. Cars passed. People walked along the sidewalk. Life continued exactly as before. Yet everything felt different. Not because I had gained power, because I had gained understanding. And as I drove home, one thought remained with me. If Vanessa had spent months trying to learn how the trust worked, then sooner or later she was going to discover something she never expected. The person standing between her plans and the Whitmore family legacy was not a lawyer. It was me. For the next several days, I said nothing to anyone about my meeting with Thomas. I continued my routine exactly as before. I watered the flowers on the back porch. I visited the grocery store every Thursday morning. I attended church on Sunday. From the outside, nothing had changed. Yet inside, I was paying closer attention than ever before. The first sign came sooner than I expected. 3 days after my lunch with Thomas, Ethan called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Mom, Vanessa, and I were thinking about stopping by this weekend, he said. It has been a while since we spent time together. I smiled to myself. Ethan rarely initiated visits. That sounds nice, I replied. Saturday afternoon arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. Around 2 o'clock, their SUV pulled into my driveway. Vanessa stepped out carrying a bakery box and wearing the same polished smile she seemed to reserve for situations where she wanted something. We sat together in the living room drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things. Their honeymoon, Ethan's work, a new restaurant opening downtown. The conversation felt pleasant enough until Vanessa casually steered it in a different direction. Margaret, she said, setting down her coffee cup, have you ever thought about simplifying things a little? I looked at her calmly. What do you mean? This house is beautiful, but it is a lot for one person. 3 acres. A large property. Lots of maintenance. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, but remained silent. Vanessa continued. There are some wonderful luxury communities for retirees now. Smaller homes. Less responsibility. More convenience. Her tone sounded helpful, concerned, caring. Yet I recognized the strategy immediately. Richard used to call it wrapping ambition in kindness. I like my home, I said. Your father and I built our life here. Vanessa nodded sympathetically. Of course. But sometimes holding on to the past prevents us from embracing the future. I noticed Ethan looking down at his coffee. He was not participating, but he was not stopping her either. The silence spoke louder than words. A few minutes later, the conversation shifted again. This time toward investments, then toward property values, then toward long-term planning. Each question sounded harmless on its own. Together they revealed a clear interest in understanding exactly what assets existed and how they might eventually change hands. I answered politely, without providing much information. The more Vanessa talked, the more confident she became. Confidence often makes people careless. Before leaving, she mentioned a particular lakefront property owned through the family trust. The moment she said its name, I knew Thomas had been right. She had been researching, gathering information, looking for opportunities. What she did not know was that I now understood exactly what she was doing. After they left, I sat alone on the porch swing watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and gold beyond the trees. Richard loved evenings like that. Quiet, peaceful, reflective. I found myself thinking about something Thomas said during our meeting. Wealth does not change character. It reveals it. The sentence made more sense now than it had at the restaurant. A week earlier, I might have dismissed Vanessa's comments as harmless curiosity. Now I recognize them for what they were. Not questions. Probes. Not concern. Calculation. Yet strangely, I felt no anger. Only certainty. The uncertainty that had followed me for years was finally gone. Later that night, my telephone buzzed with a text message from Ethan. Thanks for having us over, Mom. I stared at the screen for a long moment before responding. You are always welcome here. The message was true. He was my son. I loved him deeply. But as I set the phone aside, another truth settled quietly into place. Ethan still believed, he understood how his future would unfold. Vanessa believed it even more. Neither of them realized that the foundation beneath their plans was very different from what they imagined. And sooner or later, the truth would force all of us to confront what really mattered. 2 weeks passed quietly. On the surface, life appeared normal. Ethan returned to work. Vanessa filled her social media pages with photographs from their honeymoon and updates about their future plans. Friends and relatives commented with congratulations and heart emojis. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen a happy young couple beginning the next chapter of their lives. Yet beneath that polished image, subtle changes were beginning to appear. It started with another phone call from Thomas. He informed me that a formal annual review of the trust was approaching. Normally, these meetings attracted little attention. Documents were reviewed, reports were presented, decisions were recorded. Then everyone returned to their lives. This year would be different. As trustee, I was required to approve several pending requests before the review could be completed. One request immediately caught my attention. It involved a proposal connected to the lakefront property Vanessa had mentioned during her visit. The proposal was ambitious, expensive, and surprisingly detailed. I sat at my kitchen table reading every page twice. The plan involved renovations, financing arrangements, and future development possibilities. Whoever prepared it had spent considerable time researching the opportunity. What stood out most was the assumption behind the proposal. The writers clearly believed approval was little more than a formality. They expected the property to be available. They expected access. They expected cooperation. I closed the folder and stared out the window. Expectations can be dangerous things. Later that evening, Ethan called. His voice sounded slightly nervous. Mom, Vanessa, and I wanted to ask your opinion about something. I listened quietly as he described the same property. He spoke about investment potential, long-term growth, opportunities for the future. Everything sounded carefully rehearsed. Then he reached the question he truly wanted to ask. Do you think Grandpa would have wanted us to make use of family assets instead of letting them sit idle? The wording was clever, emotional, designed to frame the issue as honoring family rather than benefiting from it. I thought about Richard, about his patience, about his wisdom. Your father and grandfather believed assets should serve the family, I replied. But they also believed stewardship matters more than ownership. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Ethan eventually changed the subject and ended the call a few minutes later. The next morning I received an email from Vanessa. The message was warm and friendly. She thanked me again for supporting the wedding. She complimented my home. She expressed excitement about future family gatherings. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned the property. Then another property. Then several investment opportunities. By the time I reached the final paragraph, the pattern was impossible to miss. Every road eventually led back to assets, to access, to control. I printed the email and placed it in a folder beside the documents Thomas had shown me. Not because the message was inappropriate. It was not. But because it revealed priorities. And priorities tell stories words often hide. A few days later, Thomas sent additional materials for the upcoming review. As I organized everything on my dining room table, I discovered a memorandum Richard had written years earlier. His handwriting covered 3 pages. The final paragraph stopped me cold. If the day ever comes when decisions must be made, choose the person who protects the family over the person who seeks advantage from it. One builds a legacy. The other consumes it. I read those words 3 times. Then I folded the paper carefully and returned it to the folder. For years, I believed the greatest challenge would be managing assets responsibly. I was beginning to understand that the real challenge was recognizing character clearly. And as the date of the trust review approached, I had a growing feeling that several people were about to reveal exactly who they were. The morning of the trust review arrived with gray clouds hanging low over the city. I left home early, carrying a leather folder filled with documents, notes, and copies of correspondence I had gathered over the previous several weeks. The meeting was scheduled at the law offices where Thomas had worked for more than 30 years. The building itself was unremarkable, but as I walked through the front doors, I felt the quiet weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Richard had trusted me with something important. For the first time, I truly understood why. When I entered the conference room, several familiar faces were already seated around the table. Thomas sat near the head of the room reviewing paperwork. Ethan occupied a chair on the opposite side. Vanessa sat beside him, impeccably dressed and projecting calm confidence. She greeted me warmly, almost enthusiastically. "Margaret, it is so good to see you," she said with a bright smile. "I hope you are doing well." I returned the smile politely. "Very well, thank you." Her friendliness felt different now. Not because she had changed, because I had. The meeting began with routine reports, financial summaries, property evaluations, investment performance reviews. Everything proceeded professionally. Vanessa listened carefully, occasionally exchanging glances with Ethan whenever certain assets were discussed. Several times I noticed her making notes. Her interest seemed especially focused whenever family properties appeared in the reports. Eventually, Thomas reached the agenda item I had been expecting. He presented the proposal regarding the lakefront property. Detailed projections appeared on a screen. Revenue estimates, development plans, future expansion possibilities. The presentation was impressive, clearly prepared by people who believed approval was likely. When the presentation concluded, Thomas invited discussion. Vanessa spoke first. Her tone remained measured and professional. She described opportunities for growth and modernization. She emphasized the benefits for future generations. She spoke about maximizing value. Several attendees nodded politely. On the surface, her arguments sounded reasonable. Then Thomas turned toward me. "As trustee, the final recommendation is yours, Margaret." The room became noticeably quieter. Vanessa maintained her smile, but I detected a flicker of anticipation in her expression. She expected a decision. Perhaps she even expected agreement. I opened my folder slowly. Inside were the documents Thomas had provided, along with copies of emails and proposals that revealed a much broader picture than the one presented in the room. "Before I make any recommendation," I said calmly, "I would like clarification regarding several assumptions contained in this proposal. For the next 20 minutes, I asked questions. Careful questions. Specific questions. Questions about financing structures, long-term obligations, risk exposure, and stewardship responsibilities. With each answer, the weaknesses became more visible. Certain projections relied on optimistic assumptions. Several risks had been minimized. Important preservation concerns received surprisingly little attention. Vanessa's confidence began to fade. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Ethan looked increasingly uncomfortable. It was clear he had not examined the details as closely as he should have. Finally, I closed the folder. I cannot approve this proposal in its current form, I said. Silence filled the room. Nobody argued immediately. Nobody raised their voice. The disappointment appeared first on Ethan's face. Then confusion. Vanessa remained perfectly still. May I ask why? She said after a moment. Her voice remained controlled, but the warmth had disappeared. I looked directly at her. Because protecting something valuable is not the same as exploiting it. This trust exists to preserve opportunities for future generations, not chase every opportunity that appears profitable. No one spoke. Thomas simply nodded. The meeting moved forward, but the atmosphere had changed. By the time it concluded, one thing had become clear. For the first time, Vanessa had encountered something she could not influence with charm, persistence, or careful planning. And as everyone gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, I saw something new in her eyes. Not confidence. Not certainty. Concern. The days following the review meeting felt unusually quiet. On the surface, nothing dramatic had happened.
No arguments. No confrontations.
No angry phone calls. Yet I could sense the shift. People reveal themselves most clearly when expectations collide with reality. A week after the meeting, Ethan called and asked if he and Vanessa could come by for dinner. His voice sounded strained. Not hostile, just unsettled. I agreed. Friday evening arrived with a steady rain tapping against the kitchen windows. I prepared roast chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes. The irony of that last dish did not escape me. When Ethan and Vanessa arrived, the atmosphere felt different from previous visits. Vanessa remained polite, but the effortless confidence she usually carried seemed diminished. Throughout dinner, conversation stayed focused on harmless topics. Weather, travel plans, work projects. Nobody mentioned the trust. Nobody mentioned the meeting. Yet the silence surrounding those subjects seemed louder than anything we actually discussed. After dessert, Ethan finally cleared his throat. Mom, can I ask you something? I nodded. Of course. He looked down at his hands before speaking. Did Dad ever tell you why he structured everything the way he did? The question lingered in the air. I considered my answer carefully. Your father believed responsibility mattered more than entitlement, I said. He wanted future generations to benefit from what came before them, but he also believed stewardship had to be earned. Ethan absorbed the words quietly. Vanessa sat perfectly still. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed uncertain about what to say next. Eventually she spoke. Do you think he would have wanted flexibility if circumstances changed? Her tone remained calm, professional, measured. The same tone she used during the review meeting. I looked at her and remembered every small slight from the past several years. Every exclusion. Every manipulation hidden beneath politeness. Yet I felt no desire for revenge. Only clarity. I think he would have wanted people to place family above personal advantage, I replied. Nobody responded immediately. The rain continued falling outside. A grandfather clock in the hallway marked each passing second. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan spoke again. Thomas showed me some of Dad's letters after the meeting. I looked up. This was the first time I had heard about it. Ethan continued slowly. There were things I never knew. Things Dad wrote about protecting the family, preserving opportunities, thinking long-term. His voice carried genuine emotion now. I realized I spent years assuming certain things would simply be handed to me someday. Vanessa turned toward him, visibly surprised. Ethan kept speaking. The truth is, I never asked why Dad made the choices he made. I just assumed I understood them. For several moments, nobody moved. Then Ethan looked directly at me. I am sorry for that. The apology was not only about the trust. I understood that immediately. It reached further back. To missed holidays. To overlooked invitations. To moments when silence should have been replaced by support. Vanessa lowered her eyes. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply listened. Before leaving, Ethan lingered near the front door. "Mom," he said quietly, "there are some things I need to think about." I smiled gently. "Take all the time you need." After they drove away, I stood alone on the porch watching their taillights disappear into the darkness. For years, I believed the greatest danger facing our family was losing assets. I finally understood how wrong I had been. Assets could be rebuilt. Investments could recover. Property could be replaced. Trust was different. Respect was different. Those things took years to build and only moments to lose. And for the first time since the wedding, I sensed that Ethan was beginning to understand that lesson too. Nearly 3 months passed before the final chapter of the story revealed itself. Winter arrived early that year. Frost coated the fields behind my home, and the oak trees Richard planted stood bare against pale gray skies. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. Ethan called more often. Sometimes we spoke about ordinary things. Sometimes we sat in silence, before one of us found the right words. Little by little, something that had been damaged began to heal. One Saturday afternoon, Thomas invited several family members to a year-end gathering at the law office. It was not a formal meeting. There would be no votes, no presentations, no legal disputes. Just a review of the trust's long-term goals and a discussion about future responsibilities. Ethan attended. Vanessa attended. So did several relatives connected to the Whitmore family legacy. As I entered the conference room, I noticed something immediately. The atmosphere felt different from the previous gathering. Less confidence. More reflection. People were paying attention to one another rather than to numbers on a page. Thomas opened the meeting by reading excerpts from letters Richard had written over the years. Some were addressed to me. Others were intended for Ethan. One passage stood out. "A family survives because people choose responsibility over entitlement. The moment someone believes they deserve everything, they risk losing what matters most." The room remained silent after he finished reading. Then Thomas surprised everyone. He turned toward me and said, "Margaret, Richard left one final recommendation regarding future leadership. He believed the time would eventually come for a transition. The decision was always yours." Every face in the room turned toward me. I looked at Ethan, then at the stack of documents resting in front of me. For a moment, I remembered the reception hall, the smiling guests, the quiet insult, the years of exclusion, the feeling of sitting alone while others decided where I belonged. Then I remembered something more important. Richard's trust in me, the lessons he spent a lifetime teaching. I stood slowly. "For several months, I have been thinking about what this family needs most," I said. "Not what benefits one person, not what benefits me. What benefits the family." Nobody interrupted. "The answer is not control. It is character." I turned toward Ethan. "Your father believed responsibility had to be earned. Recently, I have seen you begin that process." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. I continued. "Effective next year, I will begin transferring certain trustee responsibilities to you under the structure your father envisioned." The room fell completely silent. Ethan stared at me. Vanessa looked equally stunned. Not because of the decision itself, but because it was not the outcome anyone expected. This was not punishment. It was not revenge. It was accountability combined with trust. Ethan's eyes filled with emotion. "Mom," he said quietly, "I do not know what to say." I smiled. "Then do not say anything. Just honor it." A few moments later, the meeting ended. People gathered their coats and exchanged goodbyes. As I prepared to leave, Vanessa approached me privately. For several seconds, she seemed unable to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. "I owe you an apology." The sentence came softly. "Honestly, I spent too much time focusing on what I thought I deserved and not enough time appreciating what you built." I studied her face. For the first time since I met her, there was no calculation there. Only humility. I nodded. What matters is what you do next. She lowered her eyes and quietly agreed. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the evening air. Ethan walked me to my car. Before I opened the door, he stopped me. "Mom," he said, "I should have stood beside you a long time ago." I squeezed his hand gently. "You are standing beside me now." As I drove home through the falling snow, I thought about the words whispered to me months earlier. Words meant to diminish me. Words meant to tell me where I belonged. The funny thing about life is that time often answers questions people think they already understand. In the end, I discovered exactly where I belonged. Not at the edge of the room. Not in the shadows. Not beneath anyone's expectations. I belonged exactly where Richard believed I belonged all along. At the heart of the family, protecting the legacy we built together.